focus of my talk today is going to be fairly wide-ranging, thinking about critical thinking ecosystems, so the interconnected way that critical thinking works, and also using some of my experience from working on developing critical thinking programs and doing training in different parts of the world. Just to give a little bit more background information about my experience specifically with critical thinking. So I have taught it at university level and also as an embedded component within English for academic purposes. I wrote Unlock First Edition, one of the books there, where there's a very strong critical thinking component. And when Cambridge revised and created the second editions of Unlock, I was the critical thinking editor across all 10 books. So it's going back to those original first editions and looking at how all of the critical thinking could be sharpened and focused and really brought out as much as possible. Related to that, with the second edition of Unlock, there's a whole new suite of teacher development material as well, specifically focused on critical thinking. And I'll be talking a little bit more about this in detail later on. And then, as I said, I've done critical thinking work in several countries, including Jordan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. So interesting to see some of the similarities, differences, challenges, different understanding and assumptions about critical thinking in all of those places. And in my talk today, I'm going to hopefully use critical thinking embedded within it and using a Socratic method, so a dialectical approach to what we're doing. So posing a series of questions and trying to answer those. So we talk about a dialectical approach, a form of cooperative argumentative dialogue between individuals based on asking and answering questions to stimulate critical thinking, draw out ideas and underlying presuppositions. And what we're going to do is, as a partnership with me and you, and getting your ideas as well to feed into this process. This quotation highlights actually one of the things that, one of the small things, but I think it's quite a big thing within how we approach critical thinking or how it's perceived around the world. So this is a quotation direct from Wikipedia, which often people would say you can't use Wikipedia. It's one of those sacred cows that we're not allowed to use. It's one of those sacred cows I would challenge, and I think it doesn't necessarily reflect where things are at. This is just a random quotation. There are many more like this of an academic saying that Wikipedia is a reputable source. And it's not to say Wikipedia is perfect, but it's one of those issues that I think as a community we need to engage with more. Again, this picture to show this idea we're trying to somehow stop the stem and of information, when actually we should be engaging with it more. So the structure of the presentation will be framed around 6 particular questions. Why is it important? Looking at the institutional level and how critical thinking works there, and then more at the classroom level, teachers and learners, before looking at how it's conceptualized and assessed more generally, ELT as an industry, and then looking at a series of changes or recommendations from my own experience that I believe should be made. So it's, say, fairly wide-ranging kind of scope. And throughout, I'll be asking you to contribute your ideas through a Padlet site. So this is a Padlet site, which some of you may have used before. It's a very useful site for getting audiences or students' views of particular issues. You just click on the cross at the bottom and you're able to add whatever you want to do. And then I'm just going to set you a small critical thinking question to test the waters on this. I'm going to show you a picture. Some of you may be familiar with this already. I'm just going to very quickly ask you to take 10 seconds and to write on the Padlet site what you see. So if you just write on the site and then we'll flick back. Is it connected? Ah, okay, good. So we've got some. So duck, a seagull, rabbit, rabbit, duck and a rabbit, a duck's head, and so on. Okay. Someone's using emojis. They're using non-linguistic forms to convey what they can see. Okay, thank you. If we could switch back to presentation. So yeah, this is a duck rabbit. Okay, and it was conceived by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's buried just a few hundred yards away from where we are today. And I think it's a useful idea for when we think about critical thinking, the critical thinking duck rabbit. So what do we see? Do we see one or the other thing? Do we see a duck or a rabbit or some sort of composition of both? And I think when we talk about critical thinking, what do we actually mean by that? And often institutions, managers, teachers, publishers, etc., do they see it in the same way? And my answer to that question is very often they don't. They see things in a different way. And this comes back to this quotation by Wittgenstein. He says, when we look at the figure, I scan it repeatedly, always following a particular path. So the meaning of the concept lies in the experience. And I think sometimes there is this theoretical understanding of what critical thinking is, and the reality in classrooms or how it's conceptualized by those different stakeholders can be very, very different. So the first question, again, if I could ask you to contribute to the Padlet site here, just 30 seconds. Why is critical thinking so important? So if you could just write a short sentence on the site. Why is it? Why are you here today? Why is there a talk about it? Why is it in so many books? Why is critical thinking so important? And if we could flick to the website, please. Okay, showing the other side of the coin. Living in an information-rich world with a lot to process. It teaches us to ask questions. It's an interesting one. It's a lifelong ability. And if I can carry on with the presentation and give you some of my thoughts on this, which I think will probably echo a lot of what you've said here. So first and foremost is the academic pathways. So something Stella Cottrell writes about, saying they're essential to those progressing to higher levels of academic studies, which was something that was true 14 years ago and is even more true potentially today. It's a way to get to further study. And indeed, so often is it sort of almost seen in quasi-religious ways. Papa Stefano and Angeli called it the promised land. This almost evangelical idea that critical thinking can solve so many problems, can be such an important aspect of English language teaching. If we look at just a website, for example, from the University of Edinburgh, and here it's very much looking at the instrumental value, as they see it, of critical thinking. It affects your academic success, it affects your employability. So one very strong, the instrumental value, the academic pathways, and also the links to employability. But I think there's other aspects as well which are often not thought about with critical thinking, and often are not conveyed necessarily in textbooks. So there's a good citizenship aspect to it as well, enabling learners to see beyond their immediate situations. This is from David Graddle in English Next, saying in a globalized postmodern world, in order to participate both in the new economy, but just not the economic aspects of that, but as a responsible citizen is also really, really important. And that idea of the flexibility of skills. And as, you know, again, this was written some time ago. Now, you know, with the gig economy and so on, jobs changing all the time. You know, I read a report that in 2050, you know, half the jobs which will be existing in 2050 are not yet invented. You know, this idea that we are preparing young learners at the moment for this future, this unknown future. So that flexibility is very, very important, and critical thinking feeds very much directly into that. Another, I think, quote which summarizes this nicely: the ability to think critically has become a fundamental learning outcome. It's expected to do. That if we don't do it, then somehow a course or a book is remiss if that's avoided. And again, sometimes if we imagine the counterfactual, if we imagine a course or book which stated it did not include critical thinking on it, it would, you know, it would absolutely tank, it would fail. Now, Unlock Second Edition with no critical thinking is something we've come to expect. It's a norm of all new textbooks, all new courses, that these words are put in. But often I don't think we really know what we mean by that, and we understand it in those different ways. And indeed, there's been, you know, over time, a critical tradition against the idea of critical thinking itself as well. And I think it's worth just exploring some of those ideas as well. So, for example, it's a reductive, hegemonic, post-Enlightenment project which presents a narrow conceptualization of knowledge. That it's saying this is one form of knowledge, but it doesn't take into account other forms of knowledge and knowledge production. And it's, as a result of that, it's a conceptualization that is not universal. There are different ways of thinking that aren't necessarily taken into account for. The term itself, as we mentioned, is contested, and it's very different how it's applied in practice and also between different disciplines. So I think often there is a gap between the theory and the practice, but then also in terms of the practice, how it's understood between, for example, different academic departments. Other criticisms, that it's not a teachable skill, that actually we're asking a lot of teachers to teach this, and we're specifically asking a lot of ELT, English language teachers, to be able to deliver this. At what point did teaching critical thinking become part of being an English language teacher? I would say that that's been happening over a long, long period of time. But they're quite separate set of skills, and there's quite a lot of expectations if we're asking English language teachers to also be critical thinking teachers. It's an additional luxury classroom practice, which does not help learners pass exams and progress, whatever that means. When I was recently in Turkey doing some work for Cambridge University Press on critical thinking, her department had asked me to go there and talk about critical thinking, but she herself was actually quite critical about the idea of it. She said, she was quite upfront, and she said, I want you here because my teachers want to learn about critical thinking, but I think it's a waste of time because it doesn't help pass those exams. It doesn't help her department meet the targets that she's had from her university. And this last problem, it's perceived and taught as a product rather than a process. It's a body of information to be learnt and acquired rather than something which necessarily changes the way that we work. And I'll come on to that more in a bit more detail later. Okay. Again, if I could ask you to go back to your phones or computers, just 30 seconds. How much critical thinking is found at the institutional level? So if you think of the institutions that you work in, universities, schools, ministries, whatever it may be, how much critical thinking do you find there on a regular basis? If you could just add some thoughts there. Not much. Succinct. To the point. Not much again. Quite a lot, though, here, different view. We're invited to analyse our systems and processes. And make positive contributions and critiques. Very little, dare to say. So mostly, it seems not a lot, but there are a few perhaps isolated examples where people, wherever it's possible, particularly related to news. Okay, so I'm looking more here at the actual institution itself and how the institution operates. So if we could flip back, thank you. I'll start this section just by looking at this quotation, which is from a course run by the University of Liverpool on creativity and critical thinking for researchers, about generating and evaluating ideas, exploring assumptions, how to identify problems, etc., etc. I put this quote up because there was a story in the British News about 18 months ago where a conservative writer and journalist, Peter Hitchens, went to the University of Liverpool to give a talk about the war on drugs, and he was asked to sign an agreement about, or to declare what he was going to talk about when he was at the university, which he then refused to do. And instead, to make his point, he climbed on his soapbox, as his headline says, after refusing to sign the university's free speech contract. And it was something I found really interesting to see this, and it seems to be to tie into a wider set of things that are happening, certainly at British universities in recent times. And this includes things like no platforming, so a form of boycott where a person or organisation is denied the opportunity to speak. They're simply not allowed to come and express their views. The idea of creating safe spaces, that an institution does not tolerate hate speech, harassment, violent or dissenting views, and so therefore creating a safe space for people. And also trigger warnings, which are statements given at the beginning of a lecture or seminar which alerts students to the fact that it might contain things which they find distressing. You know, I'm personally not taking any particular position on these things. I think a lot of these ideas do come from a good place, but I think there's a real challenge, especially for students, if they're coming from overseas to the UK, where they've been learning about critical thinking, where all the books they've been seeing have been talking about critical thinking and seeing all sides of the story and allowing free speech and all these things. And when they come to those institutions, there's perhaps a very different emphasis which is given. The very fact that you've been learning about critical thinking and free speech, you come here and then there are things like no platforming, safe spaces and trigger warnings. So I think it can be very difficult often for students to assimilate that. And there's other things that it can lead to as well. So this, you can't read this, but this was a letter sent by an MP to all vice-chancellors of universities about, sorry I have to talk about Brexit, but it's, I think it's inevitable these days, where he asked, I was wondering if you'd be so kind as to me, supply me with the names of your professors at your establishment who are involved in the teaching of European affairs with particular reference to Brexit. So this was by a sitting MP to university vice-chancellors. Again, seeming to contradict almost the fundamental principle of university, certainly universities in the West, you know, which since 1088 in the University of Bologna has been the focus of seeking after truth and allowing freedom of speech to get to a particular answer. And so much of that influenced latterly by John Stuart Mill from the 18th century and his idea of intellectual pacification, that if you don't allow the exploration or the discussion of these sorts of things, then intellectual critique and so on does not go anywhere. It's pacified, it's restricted. You know, his view was based on the harm principle, and I think this has been, certainly over the last 200 years, a very, very influential idea. The idea that you should be allowed to discuss things and talk about things up to the point where you harm somebody else. And it seems to me now we're in a process where perhaps that paradigm is being re-evaluated. My view is that in this sort of, at the present day, with the changes in the world, and the political changes and so on, not just Brexit, but in other areas as well, the critical thinking is more important than ever, and that universities have a more important role than ever in pushing forward critical thinking. But they should espouse that in terms of what they do, not just in terms of what they say. You know, we're in an environment now where certainly with a lot of politicians, you see the idea of changing your mind, of showing critical thinking, is a sign of weakness. It's emasculating. You know, we only need to look at some important, influential political figures nowadays to see that's the case. The idea that you would rewind on certain things or rethink certain things is not even really countenanced. You know, this quotation here, critical thinking means questioning not only assumptions of others, but also questioning your own assumptions. You know, when Donald Trump is shouting fake news, there's very little evidence of that. And I think universities more than ever have to be pushing that forward, because with our political leaders, that's not necessarily taking place. But if we think away from the macro, more down to this, for example, the departmental level, this is perhaps also the case as well. So here, not TTT and STT, so teacher talking time and director talking time. So in staff meetings, how much do teachers talk? How much do directors talk? And I like this quotation, which is taken from a blog by Alex Wright. I have a suspicion that not all employers want their employees to be critical thinkers, or if they do, they don't want them to be critical thinkers all of the time. And I think certainly my own experience of previous departmental managers, this is very much the case. It's, you know, teach critical thinking to your students, but don't be too critical in staff meetings, etc., etc. So I think, again, there are perhaps contradictions in terms of how critical thinking takes place within the ecosystem of the organisation and institution. Okay, what do teachers and learners think about critical thinking? Again, please just add your thoughts, 30 seconds. Learners take it for granted. Yep, I think that's certainly the case. Outcome and progress. Teachers think it's important, learners don't always know, yes. It's something they're told to do, and I think that's, again, perhaps one of the challenges, that they have very little agency in terms of doing this. They don't necessarily know why they are learning critical thinking, or they don't know what to do with it always. It's a waste of time. That's the view. Okay, thank you. So if we flip back. So begin this section with this, I think, quite interesting quotation. This is by a novice teacher, a novice EAP teacher. What she says, when she started, I turned to more experienced colleagues for advice. But from doing this, she found that many of her colleagues were equally unsure about what critical thinking was. And I think this is a common thing, that teachers don't always know what critical thinking is, or they don't necessarily know how to teach it. And I think it comes down to different perceptions of what it is. But also that, again, it's come back to this idea, why are English language teachers responsible for teaching critical thinking? So Cambridge last year tried to do something to find out more about this, and actually got some quantitative data rather than just sort of qualitative feedback or anecdotal information. We involved 1,000 teachers from 81 countries, so it's quite a wide sample. This is all available online on the CEP site. And from this, 93% of the respondents agree it's important to develop students' critical thinking skills. But only 20% said that academic English courses support this. So there's an overwhelming support that it was important, but only 1 in 5 thought that existing courses supported it. Again, a similar number only thought they had the material to do this. Only 4 in 5 teachers don't think they have the sufficient materials to be able to teach critical thinking effectively. Half said they had not enough time to do it properly, and only 1 in 6, 17%, said they'd had any specific training or coaching. So again, the overriding narrative is, here is, from a teacher perspective, it's important, but teachers don't have the support or the knowledge, the capability, the help to be able to do it effectively. So to give an example from my own experience of writing Unlock with Cambridge to try and remedy some of this, to try and support teachers through the material. So with Unlock, what we try and do is, there's a very clear focus on what the outcome is going to be, what the critical thinking is for. So here, at the end of this unit, you'll write 2 comparison paragraphs, compare and contrast the 2 shark species in the diagram. So first of all, giving a specific focus, why the students are learning this critical thinking. And the critical thinking feeds directly into the task which they're going to do. Then there's this useful sort of grey box type information which gives a very short, concise summary of the particular skill that is being developed. Again, being upfront to the student about what they are learning and what that core information is. Then there's this graphical organizer. So again, the idea was trying to embed some of the skills that they will need when they are at university within the materials here. So getting familiar with those sorts of useful graphical organizers. There's a link here to, the skill with the part of Bloom's taxonomy, which it's referring to, analyze, and so on, and then a series of activities to develop that skill. So we were very conscious to try and embed this within the materials, the student materials, and subsequently in the second edition, in the teacher materials as well. So there are some very specific information within the teacher development materials to try and help teachers in terms of developing their own critical thinking capabilities, but also to teach the critical thinking material more effectively. So for example here, the Be Informed, drawing appropriate conclusions from graphical data, that's the particular focus this is in a different unit. But it's giving 3 reasons why they're doing it. So when students in a class ask them, why are we learning this? They've got ready-made information there to be able to share with the students about that. Then in the be confident, it's giving the teachers confidence to be able to teach the skill effectively by developing it for themselves. So they do a similar type activity to the learners in order to develop this skill. So develop the skill for yourself by doing X, Y, and Z. So then be ready about how it would actually work within the class itself, being flexible, how you differentiate, assuming there's different levels of critical thinking ability within a particular class. Being reflective, so after it's been done, how you can then reflect on that and develop it and potentially do it better next time. And then being collaborative, how you share that with your colleagues. So it's a very sort of structured approach, but it's really looking at how teachers can develop their own skills and capabilities within the critical thinking ecosystem. From a learner perspective, well, again, ask the question, what do we know about learners and their views on critical thinking? And my sort of response to this would be not very much, because I don't think we've asked them very much. Not historically. How much do we do it on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis in the classroom? I don't think particularly, not very much in my sort of own experience and knowledge. And do we do anything with the information we get? Again, not very much. I think there's often a gap in terms of knowing what learners know about critical thinking and what they can do with it. So this results in, I think, a scant research base, and with that, the learners are disenfranchised from the process. Again, a couple of the comments that people were making there, that teachers think it's important, but learners perhaps don't. Well, that's potentially because they're not really part of the process. There's a gulf between the content and the practice and transferring that. I think one of the problems of that is critical thinking is often taught as a standalone skill, and students then have problems in actually applying it in reality. It's also sometimes unclear what we expect them to do. And I think this links back to what I was saying about the institutional level, that they are told you must be critical, you must consider all different sides and so on, but the institution itself is not doing those particular things. It can potentially be dangerous for overseas learners to be critical if they're coming from cultures where there are different expectations of what being a student is, or different expectations of criticality. It can potentially, people are not necessarily always able to share exactly what they want to share, or may need permission to be able to do that, or they may need to do that over a longer period of time. And also the feedback that students often get from teachers is not very helpful. I've seen it many times. Be more critical. What the hell does that mean? It's not at all helpful. I used to coordinate a module, and that's sometimes you'd see that. The other teachers have said, well, what can the student do with that? Very little. So learners know they need to be more critical, but are unsure how to do it. I'll give an example now. This is an essay. I used to run a course called Culture Theory and Society. It was a sort of introduction to economics and politics and so on. A student was writing an essay on Thatcherism in the 1980s, and he'd obviously been listening about critical thinking. He wanted to use a source. He wanted to do a bit of primary research. And so he'd done all of that, and this is the sentence that he wrote. According to my friend Steve, who is from Newcastle, everyone hates Thatcher, was what he came up with. Again, it's obviously problematic. He needed to be more critical, as I told now. But it's, the processes were right. He was going in the right direction. Obviously, the execution is not ideal. But those are some of the challenges, I think, which learners are facing. And when learners then do want to try and improve their critical thinking, they may try and find information or get books on it. And I think there's problems there as well. These are a couple of books that was two of the best-selling books on critical thinking from Amazon, which I just got. This is one, Critical Thinking, a concise guide. If you develop your ability to analyze people's attempts to persuade so that you can accurately interpret what they are saying or writing and evaluate whether or not they are giving a good argument, whether for et cetera, it carries on. If you're at this level of language, you may not need this book. This is one of the challenges, and this is written in a very convoluted, difficult C1 standard of English. But there are other issues as well. These are direct quotations. Critical Thinking Skills for Dummies, classic academic tome. The chapters in part 4 are all about that, and where I take a good look at the key skills of informal logic, for example, the fallacies that many critical thinking experts wax long on. Again, using very colloquial language, challenging language. If you're a B1 student who's trying to deal with feedback that says be more critical, and this is what you get, it's very difficult to make that leap. So I think even if learners do want to improve, they find it very, very difficult sometimes. I'm just conscious of time, so maybe I won't ask you to contribute to this one. So just moving on to thinking about how it's conceptualized and assessed. So yeah, still, the influence of Bloom is still very, very apparent in courses, in books. These 3 quotations were taken from a website, an online forum with people sharing their ideas here. So Bloom, his ideas are still very, very influential. The original taxonomy, which he created, and then the revised one later on, which switches a couple of them around, renames them, adds into it to make it feel more active and something's happening. So still very, very influential in critical thinking around the world and in teacher training programs and so on and so on. Now, these are sort of often been revised or changed, so I think it's one of those things that's in a process of shift. So this was taken, just some different representations of the same ideas of Bloom, just taken from Pinterest to sort of show the ways that different people have reinterpreted Bloom. We'll just have a look at a couple of these in more detail. So here's one, for example. So it moves away from the very rigid pyramid taxonomy that Bloom presents to one that looks at how those competencies are more embedded within each other. And again, adds on the right-hand side here this more sort of dialectical kind of aspect here. Can the learner use information in a new way? Can the learner justify or stand a decision? So it's taking those ideas and I think making them slightly more user-friendly. Another one here, this one focuses on creating at the top of the pyramid as being the main idea, but all of the other cogs in the machine are turning around as well. So again, showing more the interrelated nature of how those different competencies work. What we did unlock was to keep the pyramid there because it is still such a presence. And if you're talking about critical thinking and trying to sell books on this, there is still a very strong expectation that Bloom will be there in some way or another. But what we did is to think about more common classroom verbs that can illustrate those points more effectively. So again, what does evaluate mean in reality in a classroom situation? Well, it means it's deciding, rating, assessing, prioritizing, etc. If you talk about understand, what would that look like in reality? And I think that's quite a useful tool because it's still talking about things which they are familiar with and that matches their expectations about what critical thinking is, but it's also presenting it in a more user-friendly, classroom-accessible kind of way. So Bloom has had several challenges along the way. For example, this one, the Biggs and Collis's taxonomy, the solo taxonomy. Other ones, such as Fink's taxonomy with foundational knowledge, human dimension, learning to learn, etc. But they haven't really fundamentally challenged, and Bloom still, 60-odd years after it was first conceptualized, is still there. And it's really the reinvention of Bloom, which I think we are seeing now. So this is an interesting thing here, Bloom's digital taxonomy, where it's using those same ideas, but looking at it within a digital landscape. So here you see on the right-hand side for the creating part, it's talking there about blogging, developing, managing, negotiating, planning, podcasting, producing, programming, vlogging, etc., etc. So it's taking those same ideas, but looking at it within a digital landscape. And when we're thinking about how it should be assessed, I think what we need to be thinking of it is as a process, not a body of knowledge to be acquired. Because the critical thinking skills which young learners today are going to need are very different to what has happened before. So this is related to things like deep fakes, for example, which are becoming, as technology becomes more and more advanced, people will be able to spot what a deep fake is. So this was an example of Nancy Pelosi, whose speech was slowed down, so it sounded like she was drunk and slurring her words in order to be more critical of her. Mark Zuckerberg recently was, again, someone made a deep fake of him, talking about how he uses data and so on Facebook. These are the different type of skills that young learners today are going to be able to develop in the future. And I think at the moment, the kind of materials and approaches that we're using don't necessarily reflect this. Specifically in terms of assessment, I think often, certainly at the university level, it's a quantitative rather than qualitative process. We almost weigh how much critical thinking is done rather than actually looking at how it's done. And I think that's really problematic. And as a result, critical thinking is often performative. It's something which students are expected to do and to show, like a peacock showing its feathers. They're supposed to show, look how many sources I've read, or look how I'm synthesizing. As a performative act, we're looking at that. Rather than actually looking at what the student is showing that they know or showing at what they understand. And this can relate, I think, to issues of epistemic justice. So how are students treated fairly within this kind of system? If they come from a culture where critical thinking is done and they can show this because they know the rules, they know what they're supposed to do, then they can often perform better. Whereas actually, are they really showing what they need to be showing in order to be effective at, say, a university level? So, for example, I think this is a fundamental question we need to ask. Does the student use a range of appropriate sources rather than, at the moment, where I think it's often, does the student use several different sources? So often we just see, well, look, they've put two sources in brackets afterwards. That shows that they understand what critical thinking is, but they're not really using those sources. So are they using it appropriately, not just are they doing it? Again, what we need to be looking at is whether students give clear, well-argued positions rather than just giving a position which shows a range of different views. And the problem is, I think in a lot of university or sort of pre-university language criteria, it's just, are they doing it rather than how are they doing it? And I think that's a shift that needs to potentially take place at the departmental level as well. And I think this slightly mechanical way of approaching it can be reflected in other areas as well. So this is an interesting thing I saw in an academic paper about how students often change their vocabulary. Again, I'm sure this will be familiar to many of you. It's this idea that words can just be swapped in and out without really knowing what they're doing. You go to F7, you find the longest, here's a 4-syllable word, stick that in, I'll get more marks under the lexical usage category on the assessment. So again, it's not just about performing, it's not just about showing these things, it's about how is it embedded within the practice. Okay, the penultimate section, then looking at critical ELT more widely. So this is coming out of the critical ELT tradition of people noted here, like Fairclough, Pennycook, and others. Some of the titles of some of their work, if you're not familiar with this, give a sense of the position that they're coming from. The politics of English language teaching, linguistic imperialism, unravelling racism in a nice field like TESOL, and the struggle to teach English as an international language. So looking at the industry of whole and how much criticality is there in terms of English language teaching. And these, I think, are some of the sort of live issues within that. Again, it being ELT, there's lots of abbreviations and acronyms here. So, for example, British English, American English versus English as a lingua franca versus any other interpretation of what type of English are students learning. English as a medium of instruction versus multilingual education. So again, those sort of contrasting positions. Native English-speaking teachers and non-native English-speaking teachers. What content is in textbook, workers' rights, and then sort of the role of IELTS as its gatekeeper function in terms of its standardized tests. So there are very many live issues within ELT as a field, but how much are we engaging with that, or how much are they on the fringes of the field and that the mainstream contains? How much is the mainstream being challenged in the modern age? So just to look at a couple of these points, thinking about what kind of English should be learnt. Are there issues of justice within that in terms of these two-person rugby? They use this phrase, unequal Englishes. Using those prestige forms of the language. Is that right? Is that appropriate? Or should we be looking at more localized forms of English? And again, this ongoing issue of English as a lingua franca, this idea of the kind of English which many people speak, which privileges mutual intelligibility rather than just interpreting L1 language norms, British English or American English most of the time. So there's a conflict in terms of actually what kind of English should we be teaching? How critical are we of what kind of English that we're learning about? In terms of textbook content as well, the hidden content of many curricula. Copley here talks about cultural artefacts which are highly regulated, standardised and ideologically positioned. And the idea that many English language courses are essentially teaching a form of neoliberalism and making people good citizens. And again, there's on other issues as well, like John Gray talking about ELT publishers refusing to segment their global markets in ways which reflect social change. So there's all sorts of issues within the actual content of what course books are talking about as well, not just in terms of the actual language, but in terms of the messages which are coming through. Again, native speakerism, another sort of very live topic, I would say, about it being a pervasive ideology. Some of these words, which he says are often ascribed to non-native speakers of English, dependent, reticent, passive, docile, lacking in self-esteem, and so on and so on. And this is a real live issue for many, many people. And I'm sure many of you in this room would have encountered some of these things. These are just a couple of things I saw on Twitter when researching this. Here's an advert for a job in China. And it says here, requirements, spelt wrong, native or looking native. Quite sure what that means. And here, WeChat chat. Why someone didn't get a job. The interviewer said you have light accent, not suitable enough to teach ESL. So again, as an industry, there needs to be much more of a light shone on some of these sorts of issues which are really affecting people on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so just to finish now, so just going to make a few short recommendations based on a lot of the things I've said. So first of all, a re-evaluation and a repositioning of Bloom. Still very important, still very influential, but my view is we need to move away from this sort of hagiographic reverence we have for him. There are some good ideas there, but there's a lot of other things that can take its place, or revising some of those ideas in a more contemporary kind of way. Again, just to sort of illustrate this point, it's from University of Arkansas, and what this is saying essentially is that younger students, people just coming to university, should be focusing on lower order skills, and more experienced ones should be focusing on higher order skills. There's a real demarcation between those two things. And I think it's a real misinterpretation of what Bloom is trying to say. But in reality, that's often how it's perceived, that it is progressing from the bottom level to the top level, which is not how thinking actually works. Baking critical thinking into ELT provision. So not teaching it as something standalone, but looking at how it's used in practice. And again, related to this, I think we need to move on. Now it's 2019 for this language of 21st century skills. Let's name them. Let's talk about the kind of skills which we're trying to develop. Because if we just lump them together under this one superordinate term, what does that actually really mean? So I think we need to really say what we're talking about when we're developing these kind of skills. I won't go into this too much detail now just because of time, but I would suggest looking at this, again, new document, framework that Cambridge has produced, which I think has a lot of influence in this. It's trying to reshape some of the ways that we conceptualize learning. So we're talking about creative thinking, critical thinking, learning to learn, communication, collaboration, and social responsibilities as a way of underpinning good ELT provision. Preparing teachers more effectively to support critical thinking in the classroom. So again, too often there's an assumption that teachers can just do stuff, but actually they need to be more supported in terms of doing that. For example, through some of the materials which I mentioned before. And the change doesn't need to be big. It can sometimes be just a very small change in practice, which can be very influential. So rather than giving students a 5-point Likert scale, give them a 4.1. So they can't just retreat to the safety of 0.3, which is often what happens when you ask them to say that. Make them adopt some kind of position one way or the other. So just making those very small changes, I think, can also be very effective. Differentiating critical thinking by subject and pathway, not just lumping it together, but actually thinking, what are you using the critical thinking for? The field of history and the field of nanotechnology have very different understandings of what critical thinking is. And I think that needs to be fed into the process. And the last point, pursuing epistemic inclusion as a goal. So critical thinking should be for everybody and not just for people who already come from a particular academic background or culture. And I think, as we've done today, for example, using Padlet is a way of being anonymous and really encouraging people to say what they think, which they might not often do if they have to ascribe their name to something. And I think it can be used in many different contexts. So this, just to finish the last thing, I did some work in Jordan with Sudanese refugees. And what I did there is I gave them the start of an essay called We Refugees by Hannah Arendt, who's a well-known refugee from the Second World War, and she wrote very eloquently about her experience there, and I talked with this group and asked if they'd be happy to do this, and they were. And they read about the experience of this woman 70 years after, and compared that to their own experiences of being a refugee. And it was a very interesting and powerful exchange that we had there in order to do that. So I think critical thinking, is much more than just being in a textbook. It can really have an impact on people's lives in lots and lots of different ways. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.